So just to start the session and give you a little bit of background, we see that the legacy of colonialism and empire has created deep global inequalities in the fight against climate change. And former colonies, we see the pattern all over the world. They're often rich in natural resources, yet they've been historically exploited through unjust systems and extractivism. Paying off their debts alone means that there's so many resources that are being taken away from the climate emergency. So countries are not just constrained by dealing with climate change, but the legacy of financial structures from the past. And we know that there are enough resources the world over for those disparities that we see in climate justice struggles. But we know that those disparities are felt the most by African descendant, racialized, minoritized, and indigenous groups of people across the world. So in some contexts, these colonial legacies have been formally examined in truth-seeking commissions of inquiry for reparatory justice that communities have fought to see established. We saw a big advocacy and explanation of the importance of that this morning by Esther. So truth-seeking is really important, and alongside thinking of this issue as gross misallocation to dealing with climate devastation, we also know that there's not been an explicit acknowledgement of wrongdoing amongst colonizer countries and those that are responsible for transatlantic slavery. So in today's panel, we're going to be exploring this interconnection between reparatory justice, environmental justice, and the economic structures that bind us to help explore what kinds of action are there and important for campaigning for change. And we have speakers here, we're really lucky to have great speakers from grassroots activism, climate law, academia, policy development that's rooted in community perspectives, and think tanks and theology. So it's a packed agenda, and as ever, in our journey towards solidarity, towards the fight for reparations, we are here to learn. So the format is I'll introduce each speaker, and then they'll then speak to a kind of broad question of how do economies and economic structures need to be repaired or reimagined using ideas of reparations, and I'll ask them about what kind of political and other alliances are needed. So I'm just going to check, do we have Makmid online? We do. Okay, so I'm going to introduce, first of all, our first speaker, who is Makmid Kamara. He's the director of the African Transitional Justice Legacy Fund, a grant-making organization that's based in Ghana. Hello to you, Makmid, in Ghana, and over to you. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Priya. Just a quick correction that I am no longer the director of the African Transitional Justice Legacy Fund. I am now the founder of Reform Initiatives. Just
Apologies.
to quickly make that. No problem at all. I think it's an old introduction that has not been updated. Now, thank you very much for this opportunity. Dear friends, colleagues, and comrades, I want to bring you warm greetings from Accra, Ghana, and from Reform Initiatives. I want to thank the APPG for inviting me to share my insights on this very important topic, and especially on this topic, which I consider as probably one of the most critical subjects in the global debate on reparatory justice. And because of the importance of these subjects, I prepared for this session by consulting with Dr. Kwame Nkrumah's seminal publication, which is titled Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. I'm sure many of you here are familiar with Dr. Nkrumah's book on this particular subject. Now, there's a particular section of this book which I'd want to quickly read from to just set the ground for my presentation. And as I said earlier, as a very important subject and topic, this is something that is not new to many of you. It's a conversation that a lot of you have been involved in, and what you're going to be hearing today is something that you've heard several times before. Dr. Nkrumah said from the end of the 19th century and onwards, colonies had been regarded as a source of wealth which could be used to mitigate the class conflicts in the capitalist states. And this policy has been used to ensure the continued subjugation, exploitation, and profiteering of the capitalist states, and subjugation and exploitation of the former colonies. Now, a critical question was posed to us as a panelist for this particular session. And the question was about how do we reimagine economies? How do we repair economies to ensure that we transition to a just society, a just and fair society? Now, in my view, to achieve a just transition, economies and structures that have been created and established to exploit, to plunder, and to subjugate must be repaired and reimagined through a framework of reparations that goes beyond the financial compensation to fundamentally transform systems and structures. We need to ensure that there is a shift to a more equitable and sustainable or indigenous models of development and transition. What does this involve? It involves restructuring global trade and finance to end exploitation. It involves returning or repatriating the stolen assets from the countries and societies from whence they were taken. And it involves giving marginalized communities more power to shape their own developments, particularly through initiatives that are community-owned and community-led. And it involves a strong emphasis on climate justice. For us at Reform Initiatives, we believe that a key aspect for repairing and reimagining our economies and structures currently, or economic structures, is to address both the historical as well as the ongoing structural injustices, which include unfair trade, exploitative investments, and of course, the enduring, continuing legacy of colonialism and neocolonialism, which Dr. Nkrumah mentioned in this book. But how can we do this? I know we don't have enough time, so I'm going to outline a few things briefly and give chance to the other comrades on the panel to expand on this subject. Many of you since this morning may have had a lot of these things already said, but one of the critical areas where we are calling for as a movement for the repairing of our economies is the restructuring of global systems. One, global trade. We believe in the re-engineering of global trade systems to end the dependence of nations on raw commodity exports and instead support the growth of competitive, value-based, and value-added economies across the world. The second thing is about international finance. A lot has been said already on the need, and so this is just a reinforcement of what has been said, that there needs to be a transformation of the international financial architecture to eliminate disadvantages such as what is described as the African premium on borrowing costs and address the flow of illicit funds. And this illicit funds is not just by Africans, it is actually also done by multilateral corporations or multinational corporations. So address the flow of illicit funds and the unfair debt burdens that are placed on African states. Corporate accountability is a significant element in the restructuring of the global systems. We need to hold multinational corporations accountable for their exploitative practices, especially in extractive industries, and ensure that investments directly benefit local communities and contribute to ecological reconnection or reimagination. And as someone who comes from Sierra Leone, a country that is known for its natural resources like diamonds, gold, iron ore, bauxite, and of course the fertile agricultural land, this is particularly crucial for me. It is very crucial to ensure that we hold multilateral corporations accountable. And I'm happy to expand on this because we've been working with several institutions like like SOMO, African Futures Lab, and others to ensure that multilateral corporations that were involved or that benefited from the exploitation or continue to benefit from the exploitation of Africa and African natural resources are held accountable from a reparatory justice lens. Sovereignty. We need to restore the sovereignty over our natural resources and our financial flows to enable the nations that have gained political independence to also gain economic independence and to ensure that communities are involved in directing their own development choices. Now, We have to look at this from a repair lens, because even the development architecture needs repairing, it needs reimagining. We're not calling here for the use of the current development models to restore sovereignty for communities. We're calling for a reimagined, traditional, community-based, community-powered, and community-owned development initiatives to restore the sovereignty of the people. The second element of this of our work and the campaign, and by here I'm referring to the movement, the African reparations movement, in collaboration with other partners across the world, is how we reimagine economic structures to ensure that we repair the economy and we advance people-centric initiatives for the development of people and planets. There are several examples already of community-led models in Latin America, in Africa, and Asia Pacific that are developed, owned, and implemented by the community. If you go to places like Guatemala, where communities have built local power and provided themselves with the kind of tools and resources that they need to ensure that power is decentralized and there is a sustainable and alternative model to decentralized systems in the production and distribution of energy, access, and resources. The second or third element in the reimagining of our economies is what has been described as regenerative economy. Now, what does this mean? This means we're moving towards a regenerative, intersectional, anti-racist, and feminist economy that involves the reorientation of relationships, the re-engineering of power structures, the redistribution of capital. By capital, I mean political, economic, and knowledge capital, to ensure that those relationships, those power imbalances are made equitable. And then the final bit is around inclusion and representation. The multilateral institutions that were established and created in the post-World War periods were never inclusive and were never meant to represent the interests of the global majority. So reforming these multilateral institutions has to be done in a manner that ensures equal representation and equal decision-making power for all people, to ensure that those that are most affected by the historical injustices that we are talking about have a say in shaping not just the current or contemporary problems, but our future. Thank you very much, Priya. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Makmid. Thank you. So we're going to move swiftly on to our next speaker, Eleanor Shearer. Eleanor Shearer is a mixed-race writer and policy researcher based in London. She's a senior research fellow at the Commonwealth think tank, where she's leading a project on extractive capitalism in the Caribbean, and she's also a historical novelist. So you have 5 minutes, Eleanor.
Thank you so much. So I am not actually going to say much in these opening remarks about where we go next. I think other panelists are going to be able to speak to that better than I can. But I am going to talk a bit about how we got here, because I think that the stories that we tell about that history and the colonial roots and ongoing coloniality of our current economic systems are key to getting to the point of being able to reimagine them. So Priya mentioned that at Commonwealth we're doing this research focused on extractive capitalism in the Caribbean, and our work is drawing out 3 themes that I think speak to really trying to land this message about how we got here. The first is that slavery and colonialism were foundational to modern capitalism, everything from the emergence of maritime insurance, financial institutions. There's an interesting paper that I was reading recently about the Bank of England loaning to slave owners in 1799 to avoid the industry collapsing in the Caribbean. And there were all these innovations in the way that they did different kinds of loans, greater loans than before. So, our financial architecture right up to the very top was deeply implicated in the plantation economies of the Caribbean. What that means for the present day is that extraction, exploitation of people, that's a feature of these systems and not a bug. That's these systems working as intended when we see these effects now, not something that you could just kind of slightly tweak and then everything will be okay. The second thing is that this is a story that doesn't end in 1834. I think we've heard lots of that today already, but I just really want to bring it home again. The emancipation story that I was taught at school was very much, slavery was bad, but then white people like William Wilberforce realised it was bad and they gave the slaves their freedom, and then the Royal Navy went out and patrolled, and isn't that really heroic? What that completely ignores is the fact that, the apprenticeship period, the fact that there were these 4 years where by law people had to work for their former masters without pay. That was effectively a second form of compensation for slave masters on top of the compensation that we've already heard about, that free labour. And a detail that I find particularly harrowing is that in Barbados, infant mortality went up in that period after 1834 because the Emancipation Act freed all children under 6. It was only people over the age of 6 that still had to work for their masters without pay. So suddenly the planters said, well, we don't need to feed your children anymore. So people's children were literally dying because they were still bound up in the plantation system. That's something that doesn't end with the end of apprenticeships. It goes right up to the turn of the century. It goes right up to the fact that in 1910, Barbados had infant mortality 3 times the rate of England and Wales. There were some parishes where 50% of children were dying before the age of 1. The economic immiseration that this system meted out on people, that continues right up to the present. It doesn't end long ago. You see the same patterns again in terms of the independence, the fact that foreign ownership, even though the industries the Caribbean relies on have changed, the fact of foreign ownership control hasn't. These islands are now dependent on tourism, subject to the whims of the global market and global tourists. You've got ecological damage being wrought by cruise ships. Every time a cruise ship drops anchor, it destroys a section of coral about half the size of an American football field, most of which dies and will not come back for another 50 years. So, the story continues. That's why it's really important to trace the roots up to the present. And finally, I think talking about the fact that empire built a world economic system, I think we can't lose sight of that in Britain, or else our politics grows ever more insular. All these things that were created by empire, the climate crisis, it doesn't stop at borders. The fact that capital moves freely across borders, that's deeply imperial in pursuit of its greater profits. Again, another sort of detail that I find particularly harrowing about the Caribbean, well, 2 things. First is that Barbados experienced this boom in export manufacturing after independence. They were following the path that the neoliberal economy told them to follow. And Intel, the American computer company, opened a big plant in Barbados. The government said, well, we want wages to rise with inflation. So over 10, 15 years, that's what they were doing. And then eventually Intel said, well, we can employ people more cheaply in the Dominican Republic. So we're going to close this factory and we're going to take it elsewhere. You've also got the fact that cruise companies like Royal Caribbean, which is worth $37 billion, is incorporated in Liberia, which allows it to pay basically no tax, ignore labour regulations, ignore environmental regulations. So I think that's all I want to say about how we got here, basically, is that you can't pretend that this wasn't a deeply entangled world system, that Britain wasn't the architect of it, the effects aren't still being felt to the present day. And I think that pretending otherwise is basically akin to when you had that apprenticeship moment at the end of slavery and planters suddenly said, well, formal freedom with no economic transfer of wealth, that means you're free, right? And you had the same thing at independence, formal decolonisation without an economic transfer of wealth. That hasn't made these things go away. So that's why I think it's really important to establish that so that we go on to thinking about remaking them. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor. Moving on, we're going to now hear from Harj Narulla. Harj is a barrister and a leading global expert on climate law and litigation at Doughty Street Chambers, where he co-leads the climate and environmental justice team. So you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Priya. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. Again, I spoke last year on the legal panel, and I think I've been promoted to the climate panel this year, so I'm grateful. So I specialise in climate litigation predominantly. So I work on cases that are focused on bringing claims against fossil fuel companies or against governments in relation to climate change. So both the harm that they have caused or their responsibilities to reduce emissions. And I've been working on a number of cases, but I'm going to speak about one of them today. And this is a case before the International Court of Justice, which gave something called an advisory opinion on climate change earlier this year. I'm just curious, has anyone heard of that case? Just a show of hands if you've got some, familiarity, just a few. So I'm going to talk about what that case means because it's quite significant for the question of reparations for slavery, because it dealt with the question of reparations in a climate change context. So that's kind of the second point I'll cover today, but I'll just start off with a description of what reparations is as a legal category under international law. So I think the first thing to say about reparations for slavery as a legal question under international law is that there haven't been any cases that have tried to seek reparations internationally. So you haven't had one country bring a claim against another country yet. There's been some domestic litigation in the US, which hasn't been successful, and some different examples of domestic claims between different communities. So one that you might be familiar with is the Mau Mau reparations case focused on the community in Kenya, and then the Herero genocide case in relation to Germany and Namibia, where Germany agreed to provide a $1.1 billion settlement to that community. But those are examples of particular communities bringing a case against or bringing negotiations or potentially litigation against governments. It's not the same as a nation, say a Caribbean nation, bringing a case against the UK, for example. So fundamentally, this is an untested area under international law, so we need to look at the kind of underlying legal infrastructure and see what tools are available for us in terms of developing a case. And helpfully, the idea of reparations is a very established part of international law. The framework that applies here is something called the Draft Articles on the Responsibilities of States for Internationally Wrongful Acts. It's a big mouthful. But basically, it is the framework which says when countries have broken international law and they have to provide remedies, what form does that take? And that takes the form of reparations. So that article, those draft articles I just referred to, have a three-part structure. So the first part is the category of restitution. So the idea is these are non-monetary remedies which can be provided when a country has breached its international obligations. So this can be things like returning land, returning stolen artefacts, paying for things like education and healthcare, or political inclusion for disenfranchised Afro-descendant communities, or things like debt cancellation. So these are non-monetary restitutionary measures, and the idea is it's trying to put the people who have suffered as a result of the international breach back into the position they were in prior to that breach. But obviously, when we're talking about slavery, we are kind of hundreds of years down the path. There's going to be a degree of harm which you can't remedy in a non-monetary way. And that's where the second category comes in, and that's the question of compensation. And so the logic of compensation is all of the harm that you can't address through things like trying to close healthcare gaps or educational gaps, or reducing the debt burden on developing countries. Those types of things, that residual harm can be compensated for with monetary payments. And there have been various calculations made around the bill that the UK owes in particular, and the kind of highest figure is one that's been put at $18 trillion. So we're talking about quite a high level of liability. Last category is satisfaction, and these are things like apologies or commemorative museums and so on. So my first point is that we have a structure in place under international law where we can seek reparations for slavery, but we just need to actually use that mechanism. I've got 40 seconds left, so I'll quickly say in relation to this ICJ case I mentioned, basically it's the biggest case that's ever been before the ICJ. It's the World Court, and it was about what do countries have to do to address climate change. That's the first question, and then there was a second question, which was if they fail to do those things, what are the consequences? And the court found that if they fail to do what they have to do under human rights law, environmental law, the Paris Agreement and so on, they are liable to provide reparations to everyone that is harmed by climate change. So that's really important because it gives us a basis in the climate change context to pursue reparations in that structure, that three-part structure I was talking about: restitution, compensation, and satisfaction. So we have a blueprint in the climate change context for future cases, which will be filed in the next couple of years, which can then be used, I think, to file cases for seeking reparations for slavery using those same precedents. So yeah, happy to expand more on that later today, but I think I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Harj. We're now going to move on to Tyrone Scott. So Tyrone is a senior movement building and activism officer for War on Want, an organisation that works in the UK and across the world to fight inequality and defend human rights as part of the movement for global justice. So over to you, Tyrone.
Cool, thank you. And I'll try my best to stick in the 5 minutes. So hi everyone, I'm Tyrone Scott. You'll see in the flyer of the programme, I think I'm down as Greens of Colour, so it might be a bit of confusion there. So I used to be the chair of the Greens of Colour, which is now called the Global Majority Greens, which is sort of the political wing of the Green Party for people of global majority heritage. And part of the work over my time with them and the Young Greens as well was working on the Green Party's reparations policy actually for the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans. But that's not what I'm speaking about today. So just very quickly, that look into that, it's a great policy. But yeah, thanks everyone and the speakers before. And I actually just came here from a protest a couple of hours ago against the Rosebank oil field, which is a proposed new oil field in the North Sea, which is basically going to have the equivalent annual emissions of 700 million people, or the equivalent emissions of the 28 lowest income countries globally, like the same as them combined, which is outrageous. And I just wanted to start there really because what was maybe positive about the action was what struck me wasn't just people's anger there about, oh, it's another fossil fuel project. It's like clearly if people had enough of this deeper injustice, and that's that our economy still rewards destruction and extraction and endless extraction. And there's a certain irony in, not even irony, but a lot of talk about reparations often, especially in the wider world, is talking about these past injustices. Yet, governments, including our own, are continuing to do harm, in which someone's going to be seeking reparations for these past injustices in the future. And I'm going to do probably a lot of talking about that continuing to do harm element. But that's really what this question is about, is what does it mean to repair or reimagine economy through the lens of reparations? And when we talk about a just transition, we can't just mean greening the existing system, to keep everything the same, but we'll just try and make it a little bit more green. We have to absolutely transform our economy that was built on endless extraction, of land, of labor, as we've heard, of life, into one based on care, solidarity, and ecological balance. And reparations has to be central to that. But the climate crisis hasn't just appeared out of nowhere. It's the predictable outcome of centuries of extraction and exploitation. For at least 500 years, this capitalist logic of exploiting people and extracting resources without limit has fueled slavery, colonialism, and imperialism, and created this global dominant economic system sort of rooted in racialized and gendered injustices, and embedded the idea that people across the global south can be sacrificed because their lives are seen as worth less than those in the north. And this centuries of colonialism and extraction has made countries in the north and our corporations that we house rich beyond their wildest dreams by looting so much of this wealth from countries across the south. And it's this same very model of extraction, exploitation that is fueling the climate crisis and catastrophe we see today. So when we talk about reparations, if we're talking about ecological reparations, climate, or even wider, it's about uprooting these systems of exploitation and oppression that keeps the majority of the world's population living in poverty while lining the pockets of corporations and rich shareholders. And sort of, again, and as we just heard from Harj there, reparations is not just about money at all, and we have it's about repair, redistribution, and stopping the harm. And we have three sort of key principles we often speak about at War on Want around just some principles of reparatory justice. It's not very simplistic, but stopping doing harm is the fundamental one, then repairing harm that's been done, and then our third principle is compensating for the harm that cannot be repaired. It's not starting at that point. And a really silly analogy, but it's kind of not silly, but like, if somebody just kept punching me in the face, but they were like, okay, well, I'll give you a fiver like every time I punch you in the face, like it's not really justice, you know. And eventually, like, it doesn't matter how many fivers add up, like I'm not gonna be able to sort that out. Then that's kind of where we're at. Like you can't just keep throwing money at it and just continue the same system, continue to extract, continue to pollute, continue to plunder. And even when we talk about our climate solutions, it's about sometimes about more extraction of lithium, cobalt, whatever it is, just continuing the same old thing and then think, well, maybe just throw some more money at it. And obviously we're far away from that anyway. Actually, our global governments right now are not throwing money at it either. But still, that is not what we're fighting for. You know, we want to shift power away from corporations, the financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank. You control so much of the debt that countries in the South are entrenched in, and get that power to workers, communities, and nations in the South. And that's part of the work that I do in the global movement space. So I'll be heading to COP30 in Belém in Brazil in 2 weeks' time. And there I'll be working alongside movements on the ground, demanding reparatory justice for planetary harm. And, you know, we're not asking to be saved by the same powers that caused this crisis. We're here to sort of demand a new economy rooted in sovereignty, care, and repair. And we're working, we're working with the People's Summit, which is a network and alliance of hundreds of movements across the world, from Asia to Africa to Latin America, to set up an alternative peoples-led summit on climate justice that will not be inside the official UN COP space. And yeah, I could do this in a minute. I'm just going to very quickly read some top-line extractions from the People's Summit Manifesto, which has been put together from, like I say, movements from across continents, which is that a just, popular, and inclusive transition is fundamental, the right to land and territory through urban, agrarian, and land reform, the establishment of food systems with a focus on food sovereignty, promoting agroecology, valuing family, peasant, and artisanal fishing production, as well as indigenous solidarity and feminist economies, the recognition of nature as a subject of rights, the protection of oceanic areas, rare land and coastal zones, the protection of biodiversity, the generation of decent work, employment and income and care policies. I'll skip a few, it's be too long, but the eradication of environmental and structural racism and violence against women and girls, promotion of free communication and cultural diversity, policies for Black youth alive, and measures for reparations and democratization of fair climate financing outside of carbon market and debt, with destruction of funds and governance by communities. And that's from the People's Summit Manifesto. So yeah, to quickly wrap up, when we talk about reimagining economies for a just transition, it's about creating systems that value regeneration over extraction, solidarity over competition, and life over profit. Thanks.
Thank you, Tyrone. So we're now going to go online, and we've got Robert Beckford joining us. So Robert is a British academic theologian, and he's currently Professor of Climate and Social Justice at the University of Winchester, and a creator of documentaries on the historical exploitation of slavery. So over to you, Robert.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm not sure if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Can, yes.
Good. Let me. Sorry, another correction. I'm no longer at the University of Winchester. So I'm currently working across 3 institutions. One being VU University in Amsterdam, Queen's Foundation in Birmingham, and a small role with the University of Liverpool. So sorry about not bringing you up to date on my current working itinerary. But thank you for inviting me. It's great to be a part of such a brilliant panel. Many of the things that I will say have already been said already, so I may just frame them in a slightly different way in the 4 minutes and 25 seconds that I have left. And also just provide you with a few concepts to work with in the discussion that we have. But before I start, I will use at least 30 seconds in saying this is contradictory as people of African heritage to have a meeting where we expect to explore deep spiritual political themes in 5 or 6 minutes. I know that the organizers are trying to pack in as much as possible, but it's actually anti-African, colonialist, and pedagogically insane to work on this basis. But having been invited, I'll do my best to contribute as much as I can, but also encourage that in the future we, as African people, use African epistemologies, pedagogies, in order to communicate these kind of ideas. So that's used up probably 2 minutes out of the 5 minutes that I have left. So let me just say something useful in the 3 minutes that I have left. I think we need to work with a set of presuppositions and then actions. And the presuppositions, I think, are integral to linking the economic transformation with the climate and social justice agenda. Is first that we start with the Black radical traditions, understanding that slavery never ended, but simply evolved. That allows us to think of the current predicament as a continuity rather than any form of break or reformation. Secondly, that we take a fugitive approach rather than a liberal approach. A fugitive approach demands that we work together as people of African heritage and with the allies that we have outside of that community, but we recognize that we have to dream up, imagine, and produce the alternative worlds that we want to see. What Jamaicans call maroonage, the Americans call the fugitive. So that's a second principle. Third principle that I think is integral for, again, thinking about the economic and the climate crisis, is to understand this as spiritual practice. African peoples always connected themselves to the land, to the environment, and saw the two as being inseparable and having a spiritual relationship between the physical body and the earth's body. And therefore, we need to think about spirituality as an integral theme within this process. So that's the principles. In terms of the presuppositions, in terms of some of the principles I just want to mention quickly, it's very easy to remember because I've labeled them ABC so that people can follow them quite easily in the room. The first is we need to have some proper accounting. Part of the problem that we have at the moment is fake accounting of the cost. And many of the reparations movements have been complicit with false accounting. Go back to the film that we made in 2005, Empire Pays Back. We use British compensation law to calculate the debt Britain owes. And we only used the labourers' cost, not the cost of the carpenters or people working in metal refineries in the Caribbean. We used the agricultural cost to come up with the calculation that we arrived at, 7.5 trillion in 2005. Later, as part of a consultant with the Brattle Group, we came up with another figure, which was 18.45 trillion. So we need to have proper accounting and not allow people like the Church of England, the United Society for Propagation of the Gospel, even the Quakers, the other organizations to get away with false accounting and giving back a pittance of what they actually took. Second thing is we need to go beyond what I would call perpetrator justice and normativity. And what I mean by this is the fact, the way in which many of these debates taking place around the economic reimagining and also the reimagining of climate in the place of climate and social justice are being done by the perpetrators, people who inflicted the harm in the first place, who were involved in the trafficking and the brutalization of African bodies on slave plantations and in the colonial context, the domestic colonial context, are still very much set in the agenda. So we have to move beyond a perpetrator justice normativity. The University of the West Indies have been complicit with this. They gave awards earlier this year to two people that they felt were the leading campaigners in reparatory justice in Britain. One was the Archbishop of Canterbury, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. Interesting. And the other was Laura Trevelyan. So two people who come out of the perpetrator class were acknowledged as being the forerunners, the significant people involved in reparatory justice work, and were honoured with honorary degrees, one in the Caribbean, one in Britain, in terms of the University of Bristol. Now, I'm not saying that the allies are important. What I'm saying is when we foreground people who emerge out of the perpetrator class as having the knowledge, interest, and ideas for rethinking the finance and rethinking the complex realities of climate injustice, we're going to run into some problems if everything we know about liberalism is correct. Finally, and to end in over 3 seconds that I may have left, I just want to say that we need to think about creative responses. If I had use of the video, I'd show you some of the work that we've been doing in creating resources for schools, colleges, churches to conscientize people. Because if one takes a fugitive approach, that we have to imagine it and create it, the first step, apart from truth seeking, has to be truth telling. And part of truth telling is conscientizing people about the relationship between the slave and colonial continuity, because slavery didn't end, it just got reconfigured into different forms of structural and racialized violence, then we have to conscientize people. So if I had access to the screen, I would have shown you some of the songs that we've produced with Christian Aid for churches, some of the resources. I've worked with hip hop artists in Britain to produce for schools, to introduce children at Key Stage 1 into understanding climate justice. And equally, some of the work that we've done with visual artists to reimagine climate justice as a spiritual practice by reconfiguring icons to reflect faith, race, and climate justice. So thank you for the time that I've had, and back over to you, Priya. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. Our final panelist, Kofi Klou, is unfortunately unable to join us, but he sends his apologies. So I just wanted to ask for a big round of applause for all our panelists again. Thank you. And we're now going to move into time to ask them questions. So please come up. There is a mic. If you want to come up, you can. And if you'd like to direct your question to any of the panelists, please feel free. Ensuring that we remember that Makmid Kamara is online as well, still joining us, so any questions can come to him as well. But please keep your questions short. Yeah. No, but if you speak to the mic, that'll be great.
Just questions to this gentleman here. The first one is...
I don't think it's on.
Could the 5 superpowers use their veto power in the criminal court? The second is, what country, so you're saying the best case scenario, the best way to get reparations is for a country to get it from another country, right? So do you have, hypothetically speaking, do you have a good case study that you think, is there a country that you think in particular has the best case to win? Yeah. What would that look like? And what would your advice be?
Sure.
Can we just take 2 more questions before we see responses? Yes.
Do you mind if I speak from the back? Can you hear me from the back?
Yeah, we can actually.
Okay, good. What I'd like to ask is... use the microphone.
Oh, for people online, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm not sure if it's on, please, if anyone could check.
Yeah. Given the issue about extractivism being linked to reparations and the issue of cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo and the nature of the companies involved in that activity, what is the likelihood of action against these companies and what would be the legal framework for any such action?
Great. And can we have any other question? Anyone else want to ask? Yeah?
Hi. Another question regarding the legal part. So Article 12 of the Paris Agreement is involving people. I was just wondering whether there are any plans to use that to put the onus of NDC implementation and involving, especially reparations stakeholders, is part of the Article 12 implementation at national level. Okay, great. Did anyone want to jump in? Did you want to start, Harj?
Sure.
Yeah, great. Wonderful
questions. So the first question on the veto powers, that's a wonderful question because you're focusing on the Security Council, which I think is relevant to any sort of diplomatic solution or diplomatic choice to award reparations. But what I'm talking about is a legal case before the International Court of Justice, which doesn't require the consent of the Security Council to bring a case like that. But there is a kind of a related issue around which countries have accepted the jurisdiction of that court for any type of case. And importantly, the UK, in accepting the jurisdiction of that court, put in a reservation. And they said that any members of the Commonwealth, any Commonwealth states, can't bring a case against us. So that could relate to, obviously, slavery, colonialism, any sort of harm that they're involved in. However, there are other routes into the ICJ against the UK in particular, and there are other Western European states like France, Germany, Italy, that haven't made reservations like that, but they have accepted the jurisdiction of the court. So coming on to your second question then, it's more difficult to bring that type of case against the UK because they've made that declaration. But there are other ways you can get to the ICJ. The first is if they agree to the case. So say, for example, you're a Caribbean state bringing a claim against the UK at the ICJ. They could theoretically agree to that case. I think that's pretty unlikely. Another way is if you bring a complaint under an international treaty that the UK has signed up to and that other state has signed up to, the state that's bringing the complaint. And the dispute resolution procedure under that treaty refers to the court. So an example here is the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, CERD, which I think is a viable route to bring a case against the UK, because it has as its dispute resolution clause that you go to the ICJ if there's a dispute between parties about the application of that treaty. So in terms of who are the best candidates for cases, I think most of Western Europe's really on the hook, right? The scale of the harm, to Robert's point about the honest accounting, the laws are really good at putting a monetary value on different types of loss, and we have every type of harm under the sun that you can think of when it comes to reparations for slavery. I actually think the Brattle Report, which is a wonderful piece of work, underestimates certain types of harm, and it excludes entire categories of harm as well, as Robert was recognising. So there are many different cases that you can bring using different communities that you focus on, different methodologies for calculating harm against, I think, most of Western Europe. I might hand over if someone else wants to take on the cobalt question.
Eleanor.
I can briefly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it might be like the most positive sounding answer, because I think the question was framed around the cobalt extraction in places like DRC and others, and like legal repercussions that these companies may face. And I was just maybe going to speak very briefly about the challenges that you can face in trying to get legal repercussions for the harm being caused by big extractive industries. So we work a lot campaigning against ISDS, which I've got it in front of me, which is Investor State Dispute Settlement, which is essentially something that has slipped into a lot of free trade agreements and load of trade agreements that a lot of countries across the global south are essentially forced to enter into because they're dependent on so many things due to many different reasons of historical economic injustices. And then within a lot of these free trade agreements is this facility for ISDS, these secret courts essentially, which corporations can utilize to sue countries and communities for basically impacting their profits. Like, it's just wild, it's undemocratic, and we don't really know much about it at all. It's all behind sort of closed doors. And just like 3 quick examples I just brought up, and this is from a couple of years ago, but it's no better now. But there's so many different suits right now. So there's one with Swiss mining giant Glencore, which is the owner of the largest open pit coal mine in Latin America, is demanding compensation following Colombia's constitutional court ruling in favor of the Wayuu people's right to water, health, and food sovereignty. So the Colombian government ruled in favor of the peoples, and they're getting sued by this corporation due to these trade agreements. Like, it's that difficult. That's how deeply entrenched these global economic systems are, and they're that deeply entrenched because of the power taken through colonial expansion. Similarly with other eco-ore materials, Red Eagle and Galway Gold are suing for lost profits for environmental protection measures. Equinor, the lovely company who are behind the Rosebank oil field that I was just speaking about at the protest a couple hours ago, they've been involved in countless ISDS cases suing countries. And a lot of these corporations have got profits and annual turnovers, unfortunately, larger than the GDPs of the countries they're trying to sue, and they're doing it in secret courts enabled by our governments, So I don't have to answer the question. It's a bit fatalistic, but just another layer of complication, I guess.
Great, and we're going to go over to Makmid, who's going to give us a perspective as well.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm really pleased that that question about Congo came up, because Congo is not just one of the biggest and most naturally endowed country in the world. It is also one of the most central landmark for the continued scrambling and partitioning of Africa in current day global geopolitics. But an example that we want to give and share in terms of how people power could actually work when you bring communities together, you bring affected individuals and societies together with support, using the law and other frameworks. Is the Bodo case, the community of Bodo in the Niger Delta in Nigeria. When in my time at Amnesty International, I was lucky to work with the Bodo community to research, collect the evidence, work with experts to present this evidence in the UK court. And then, of course, it ended with an out-of-court settlement between Shell and the Bodo community. So many lessons to learn from that, because as we speak, the problems are there. The community remain polluted. Shell has not cleaned up the Bodo community after years of pollution and death and destruction and land thefts of the resources of these people. This is one of the things that the Ken Saro-Wiwa, the environmental rights activist, was killed for by the Nigerian state in cahoots, of course, as has been shown now in recent revelations from the court, with the support and complicity or acquiescence of this multinational company. So with the case of Congo is a complex one that requires in-depth and sustained advocacy and mobilization and solidarity. We are seeing something emerging similarly in Namibia with the Shark Island case. And I'm going to stop here because there's a lot to share, and I know perhaps Robert and others may want to come in. But there are several communities in Africa that have cases that you could bring against multinational corporations and their complicit states, whether it's the Netherlands, whether it's the UK or Germany, to ensure that the communities get repaired, but the affected people in those communities also get the recompense and the remedies that they need. Over to you, Priya.
Thank you. We have time for another round of questions. So, yeah, sure. Unless there's anyone. Okay, we'll come to Sai and then to yourself, and then we can take one more if anyone else has got a question.
Yeah, just building on the question of litigation and I guess learning from the Mau Mau case, because many people see that as a victory, the Lead A case, but that also presents a challenge in that, you know, the community will not be able to go back and claim compensation. It was a very small amount compared to what the lawyers got. So can we speak to the damage of individual cases, and also referring to Esther's prompt at the beginning of the day, the idea that, you know, this can't be a single state, single country thing. It has to be Pan-African. So some thoughts on the Pan-African nature of what we're doing.
Great, and these two questions. Perfect.
Yeah. It was just a question for Robert. I haven't really heard much talk about this, but I wondered, we know like the Kingdom of Benin and the Ashanti Kingdom sold enslaved people, and there are still families that have acknowledged the wealth made from that trade. And I was just wondering if there was any talk about maybe redistribution of the land to the descendants of those enslaved people.
Great, thank you. And I think there's a question here in the front as well.
So yeah, on the topic of Pan-Africanism, how do we define development in post-colonial contexts where resilience, dignity, and sustainability are central? And what partnerships or alliances between regions throughout the diaspora could accelerate a shared reparatory climate agenda?
Great, thank you. So I'm going to bring in Eleanor first to respond. Thank you.
Yes, I was just going to pick up on, I'll leave some of the legal questions to the experts, but on that final point, especially about kind of reimagining development, because I think that that's something that has come up in this research that we've been doing about the political economy of Barbados and the wider Caribbean, because I think it's really important to emphasise that at the point of decolonisation, where there were experiments in alternative pathways that didn't fit the kind of US anti-communist hegemony. So we're talking about Guyana, we're talking about Jamaica and Michael Manley, we're talking about Grenada. Obviously, those were like brutally suppressed by the Americans. And I think that we as an organisation that think a lot about issues around ownership would see that as kind of the starting point. Like, you need to think about basically who owns resources, who's able to sell those resources, profit from those resources, and on what terms. And I think that the starting point for kind of quote-unquote development conversations needs to be those issues of power and resource distribution and ownership. And at the moment, you have the replication of those old colonial models when you do have these foreign corporations coming in. And it's not just a matter of the obvious examples of, like, you know, your Royal Caribbean cruise liner obviously just extracting a huge amount of wealth from the region and causing ecological damage. I think it's also things like, although there have been some welcome steps in the Caribbean towards thinking about rewiring of financial architecture when it comes to climate finance, often those aren't really going far enough in terms of they're still going to saddle countries with debt, even if those debt now comes with slightly better conditions. And so I think that being more ambitious as well, when we think about resources for the transition, it's not a case of saying like the terms need to be slightly better. It's a case of thinking that we need to completely reimagine the system that basically asks people to become indebted for something that they are just owed as a matter of right. Because, again, to give a statistic, the Caribbean is responsible for 0.15% of historic global emissions. And yet it's the second most hazard-prone region in the world. These are countries that are 7 times more likely to be hit by natural disasters than larger countries. And so, I think on those development questions, ownership is really crucial. Thinking about the broader financial architecture is really crucial, and reimagining all of that is going to be critical to making sure that development can come on the terms that you specified.
Thank you. Over to you, Robert, on the question that was directed to you.
Yeah, there has been a recent effort by Ghana, Benin, and Rwanda to re-engage with its diaspora. These projects are fundamentally about settlement and citizenship rather than any form of economic restitution or compensation, although the project in Benin does come with a ceremony which acknowledges rupture and the fissures of transatlantic chattel slavery and readmittance into a national and cultural community. But these projects need to be critiqued on 2 levels. One is that if people are returning, they don't necessarily want to become part of another class that oppresses the working class, working poor proletariat people within the country. And I don't think there's been enough thinking about how having diasporas return. We know the history of Africa in terms of West Africa. When diasporas have returned or people have settled, they often become part of an elite that becomes part of a problem rather than part of a solution. Secondly, because there hasn't been any assessment of what this means in terms of resource management and development, there hasn't been any kind of real thinking about what this means in terms of addressing issues of sustainability. So while they are culturally and politically important, they are economically and environmentally underdeveloped.
Thank you. So we had another question. Did anyone else want to respond on the impact of cases that do not go well and the legacy of what they leave given the apparatus available?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. I think the first thing I'd say is that law is not a silver bullet in this area or in any area. I think of it as a form of campaigning, which only works effectively when it's part of a broader campaign. But it's useful in breaking through, a regressive status quo, which is what we have at the moment. We have Western European governments that are, broadly speaking, not even apologising or taking any responsibility for certainly slavery and have a much more kind of mixed picture when it comes to climate change, but certainly aren't carrying their fair share of the burden. So I think law and litigation can be powerful in terms of forcing them to act and crystallising litigation risk. So that's a separate question, to what actually happens in the cases and whether or not the settlements are just, whether or not the calculations are correct, if compensation actually is adequate for the community, who's representing the community, does everyone sign up to that, the degree of consultation and engagement when you're building a case. These are all the complexities that it's an imperfect science and you get kind of mixed outcomes. So I think it sort of shows that you need to be sensitive when you are developing cases to try and address the needs of whoever the claimant is. But what I will say, just kind of thinking about the comparison between the climate movement and the movement around reparations for slavery, the way I often think about where the approach to litigation is at in the slavery context is that it's where climate litigation was 20 years ago, where the idea that you could hold governments accountable or corporations accountable through the law for their complicity in something as large and nebulous as climate change, which everyone is kind of responsible for in some way or another. And it's very diffuse, and all of the activities by and large were lawful. How could you hold anyone to account for that? And now, 20 years later, you have 2,500 cases that have been filed, a huge diversity of different types of cases you can bring by different types of communities, by nations against other nations. You have a lot of options there when you're trying to use the law to compel action. And I see litigation for slavery is at the beginning of that process. So we have a handful of cases, but I think that they will grow in number, they'll grow in sophistication, they'll grow in appropriateness as well, and they'll be at different scales. So I've spoken today about an international case, but you can also have a case with a particular community against the Church of England, right? Or against a particular company that maybe is still extant and was around 300 years ago, and they're still living off the profits. So I think, the message is to take away is law is not a silver bullet. It needs to work in partnership with other campaigns. It can bring politicians and governments to the table. And we need, I think, more of these tools to ratchet up the pressure and the threats so that they ultimately come to the table and come to a political solution, which I think is the only real outcome that will be just ultimately in this area.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are not going to be able to take any more questions, but this has been a brilliant session, so informative. Thank you once again to Makmid, Eleanor, Harj, Tyrone, and Robert, and to all of you for great participation. We are now being asked to return to the main hall for the final session, please. So if we can all make our way down to the main hall for the final session. Thank you all.